So let's learn about the important data types inside of SQL. Imagine you want to define an age, for example. You have different data types that you can use to store a number inside of a database. And the first one would, for example, be a tiny int, as you can see right here. And a tiny int usually allows you to store 8 bits of data, which essentially means you can store numbers from 0 to 255 or from -127 to 128. So essentially you can store 256 numbers. If you use negative numbers, you can store everything from -127 to 128. And if you store only positive numbers, you can store everything from 0 to 255. So essentially 256 numbers, which is equal to 8 bits. And if you think about an age, this could actually be enough, or this should actually be enough. But if you imagine, okay, now we have someone who gets 1,000 years old or whatever, then you might want to use a small int, for example. And a small int can store 16 bits, so it can essentially store twice as much data. But this does not mean that you can just store 510 numbers, because with every bit you add to the storage, you essentially double the amount of numbers that you can store. So 8 bits allows you to store 256 numbers, which means 9 bits allow you to essentially store, so 9 bits allow you to store 512 numbers, 10 bits allow you to store 1024 numbers, and so on. So as you can see, the range you can store really increases rapidly with every bit you add. So small int is essentially a little bit better already. Now with the normal int, you can store 32 bits of data, which is probably enough for pretty much everything you do. So usually you use a normal integer. And now if you really need super big numbers, you can use big int, which allows you to store 64 bits of data. Now if you want to store whether the user is above 18, for example, you could, for example, say is above 18, and then you can say you want to store a boolean, for example, so either true or false. If you want to store a character, let's say we want to store a grade, then you could say grade. We want to store a character of length 1, for example, which actually means you can just store one single character inside of this char variable. So you can either say A, B, whatever. And if you say 10, for example, you could not store A inside of this grade variable, because you would need exactly 10 characters. So if we are saying 3, for example, you would need something like A, B, C, and A, B would not be all right, even though it's like smaller than 3, but since we define 3, you need to have exactly 3 characters. If you want to have a variable text up to the length defined, you usually use var char. So for example, you can say we accept everything up to 255 characters, and now you can say this here is valid, this here is valid, this here is valid. So varchar is usually for a lot of things the preferred choice. So now for grade, you could also say, okay, you want to use text, which essentially allows you to store approximately 15 to 20,000 characters. So usually text is really alright for pretty much everything, but if you actually even need more for a blog article, for example, you can use medium text, for example, like so. And if medium text isn't enough, you can also use long text, for example, but usually text is just fine and you can just go ahead and use text. Now imagine you wanted to have a created at field, for example, for the user, and you want to store the date. In that case, you can store a date variable, for example, which allows you to only store the date. Maybe you also want to store the time, and then you can use time, which only allows you to store the time, but not the date. The date only allows you to store date, but not the time. So if you want to store date and time, you're going to use date time. So now you're storing date and time. And now you also have timestamp, which essentially also stores date and time. But if you use on update, for example, current underline timestamp, like so, this essentially allows you to update the timestamp every time an update happens. So for example, if the user has been created, you store the timestamp, but on every update, you also update the timestamp. If you want to create a number of predefined values that the user essentially can select from, you can use the enum value. So role, for example, let's say the role is an enum and allows you to select a couple of predefined values. So he can, for example, be a normal user. He can, for example, be an admin, or he can just be an outsider, for example. I don't know. So now you've defined a couple of possible values for the role variable. And in case you want to store JSON data, for example, settings, you can say settings, have the data type of JSON. So now you can, for example, store JSON data inside of the settings variable.